terms of MIS schemes generally has been that in the past, the flood of money into these schemes meant that the promoters went out there and bid up the price of land and overcapitalised in effect the underlying investments. Is that true of Timbercore?
We're seeing asset values that are definitely below book value. I suspect that will be part about all assets were sought after in 2005, 2006, 2007. People bid up all assets, not just these. And of course the price of assets, given the lack of equity and debt, have come down. So yeah, there's a bit of both in there, I think.
Timbercore and Great Southern are, in a sense, the unfortunate exceptions, along with, I suppose, the early Russian financials who collapsed at the onset of the global crisis. We haven't seen anything like the widespread defaults and the widespread insolvencies that we saw back in the early 90s. Can you explain why we haven't seen that and what the differences are between then and now?
Well, I think a lot of people ask me what's the difference from the last crash, and I think we've had a couple where it's the early 90s and then there was sort of some of the icons in the 2001, but I just see it's completely different to the early 90s. I mean, for a start, with predominantly property issues in the early 90s, and remember the interest rates were 22%. Property yields at best are 7 or 8, so you're always going to have a cash flow problem. What are interest rates? Went up yesterday, but they're still sub 4%. So completely different. I think you've seen the economy is not as bad. Now there's a number of reasons for that, but obviously the stimulus package has helped that, but the unemployment consumer confidence is a lot better. The 90s, the lending was triggered by, remember we deregulated the financial markets in the mid-80s, so there was lots of people lending in lots of different ways, and we saw a lot. The State Bank of Victoria ended up in Commonwealth Bank, and there was Tricom and all those. So there are some non-bank financial institutions around it. There's been some collapses, but not like the 90s. But I think interest rates is probably the fundamental difference. And this recession that the world is having is actually because the global financial system collapsed. Well, this is staggering, isn't it? Well, it's been propped up by the government.
Staggering that it wasn't worse than it was.
Well, I mean, the 1990 was about almost good old-fashioned economics. Things weren't working, people weren't buying, and all this. This thing is about the global banking system collapsed. I mean, you get the investment banks that we get at 35, 40, 50 to 1, and all of a sudden everything sort of stopped. So I think it's very different this time around.